Be a good one. Cool. Okay. So we'll knock out some logistics stuff. Thanks for hanging on a Monday night. We want to welcome you if this is your first CALU Community Journal Club. And I'm actually going to put the link. You guys are probably already members, but if you're not, the free CALU Community Facebook group, where all of our announcements, awesome discussions, and resources for free. So if you're not a member of that Facebook group, click that link in the chat and request to join. And as far as these meetings go, how you can participate, you can always just be fly on the wall, active listener, soak up the conversation. We are going to do awesome breakout rooms like we always do. I'll probably try to do those a little bit earlier in this meeting because that's been some of the feedback that we've been getting. They'd like to kind of get into the breakouts a little earlier to get the juices flowing. So we'll try to do that in this meeting. And if you have a comment or a question that you want to kind of join in the conversation, you can just unmute yourself and join in. But if you don't want to interrupt whatever flow is happening, you can raise your little icon hand. There should be one there by your name, and that'll be a cue for us that you've got something to say. Or you can type the word comment or question into the chat in all caps, and that'll be our cue to be like, all right, so-and-so, you have something to say, we'll unmute you, and it's let's hear it. And you can always just type your comment or question in the chat as well if you don't want to unmute yourself or turn your camera on. We do encourage you to turn your camera on though, just so we can have conversation with your beautiful faces. And then just use the chat as kind of free-flowing conversation as you feel free. It's always good. You guys share awesome resources in there. So these meetings are always open to anybody who wants to join. So if you have a friend or a colleague that was get something out of it, have them join in next time. We do them twice a month, every 2 weeks. And I'm going to drop the link to the paper in here too, just in case you should have got it in your confirmation email, but just in case you didn't, that link that I just dropped in the chat will take you to the PDF so that you can download that and read it or follow along as we're going. And just one quick note on sound. Let's say you were unmuted previously and you were talking and joining in the conversation, and then you're not talking now. Just try to remember to mute yourself again so that no background noise comes in. With all of that said, welcome to the CALU Journal Club meeting number 12. My name is Quinn Hennick. I am a proud clinical athlete provider. I am joined by Kevin McNamara, who is a physical therapist in the Seattle area. He runs an awesome clinic up there, and he's been a part of the clinical athlete community for a long time. And in fact, the journal clubs are his idea. Like, we're probably coming up on 3 years now that we've been doing these. So that's pretty cool. Kevin, what's up, man?
Not much, Quinn. It's been a little bit. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, it's good to see you. We missed you.
Yeah, it seems like things have been going awesome, man. So,
well, it's going to be even more awesomer that we have you. I promise. And we are joined by, I think, let me make sure. Is Megan here?
Okay. I'm right. Yeah.
How'd you know I was going to say you? Jeez,
I don't know.
Just assumed. Okay.
That's scary.
Megan is our all-star journal club intern, clinical athlete forum student ambassador. She's a student, PT student down in Texas. Megan, how you doing?
I am good. How are you?
Good. Did you start? Have you started your next clinical?
Oh yes.
Is it awesome?
Well, it's inpatient rehab, so you know how it goes.
Different than the other one, then.
Large change of pace.
Big difference. Yep. Good experience. And if any of you are curious, so we have a model for these journal clubs, and we took this model from the great Benjamin Franklin, when he used to have his Junto clubs back in the day, and their motto for their meetings were that any discussions were in the sincere spirit of inquiry after truth, without fondness of dispute or desire of victory. And all that means is we're not coming in here looking to win an argument or to leave having been right. We're all just trying to be less wrong, but we encourage discussion and disagreement. We don't all have to agree on stuff. So we just want healthy discussion, and we're all on the same team. I'm going to launch a poll here just to get a feel for the room. And that should pop up in front of you. We just want to know if you're a clinician, student clinician, or you coach trainer, student coach trainer. Click that button if it's in front of you. Do you see the poll, Megan? You do? Nobody's clicking it. Kevin, do you see the poll?
Yeah, I just voted, man.
Oh, you did? It's not updating on my end. Sorry. Everybody's like, what the hell are you talking about? All right. Well, that's what I saw. 0% of the people are the people. Usually it's about mostly clinicians. It's weird. All right.
Yeah, it's so it's 60% clinicians, 40% students.
It just says 0 zeros on my end. I swear I'm not crazy or dumb. I mean, well, we'll move on. Okay. So we've got an interesting paper. And I'm going to jump right in and just real quick overview the paper. And I'm going to throw it out for initial thoughts. And then I think it's a good idea to jump into the breakout rooms. I do have some, I certainly have some thoughts on the paper. We really want to get your all's take on this. So the title of the paper was Motor Learning Methods that Induce High Practice Variability, Reduce Kinematic and Kinetic Risk Factors for Non-Contact ACL. So this was an experiment. So a lot of times in these journals, sometimes in these journal clubs, we have papers that are, you know, expert opinions or viewpoints or clinical practice guidelines or some things that are not just kind of experiment or data driven in and of itself. They're more kind of aggregating research on a particular topic. Whereas this was a study, and they were trying to look at the differences in different teaching styles or pedagogy, which is essentially just a method of teaching in sporting tasks. So different ways that we practice. And they use 3 different methods: linear pedagogy, nonlinear pedagogy, and differential learning. And I was trying to think of ways to kind of conceptualize this. I think we all probably come from different sporting backgrounds, and we can probably bring it into context for whatever sport that you're like familiar with. But let's just say it's a barbell back squat, to bring my bias in here. So linear pedagogy would be me as a coach teaching somebody how to back squat. This is how you back squat. This is where you put the bar. This is where you put your feet relative to your body. This is how low you squat. And these are the standards of the lift. And so you start painting the picture, and you don't deviate from those things. And you have the person repeat, rinse, repeat, lots of practice, lots of repetitions. When they become proficient in those early stages, for the back squat example, you could be like, okay, those exact same rules apply. Now let's slap 10s on the end of the bar. Let's see if you can still do the movement the way it's supposed to be done. Boom, boom. So you could take that with shooting a basketball, kicking a soccer ball, which was the example here, was soccer, and it was cutting. It was a cutting task that they measured. So that's linear pedagogy. And then nonlinear pedagogy in that back squat example would be like, okay, the goal is to squat this low and stand up. Now you figure out how to do that. And so the person kind of gets under the bar. Maybe the bar has to be on your back. They get under the bar, they put their feet wherever they choose to. And then I say, okay, now I slap some weight on there. I don't give them any other instructions. I just change the constraint of the exercise. And you know the goal is to go down there and stand up. And maybe they move their feet around, they go fast, they go slow. So they're exploring different movement solutions to get the task done. And then differential learning is the coach is putting variation onto them, imposing the variation. And so I say, okay, for this rep, you're going to put the bar up high and you're going to squat at this tempo. They do 1 repetition that way. And I say, okay, now you're going to put the bar low. Next rep, now you're going to go this fast or this slow, or I'm going to explicitly tell them the variation that I want them to do, and no variation is repeated. So again, you can extrapolate that to anything. They extrapolated it to tasks in soccer, like kicking a ball, passing, those types of things. So they took 62 or 66 male recreational active people who had no idea how to play soccer. They were beginners, and they split them up randomly into those 3 groups: linear pedagogy, nonlinear pedagogy, differential learning. And it was a 12-week program. And they only had one test. A test was a cutting task, which I have a few thoughts on, but essentially they ran forward 5 meters and they made a 45-degree cut and ran for another 5 meters. And at that cut, they measured force. They had force plates and they were on a 3D motion capture system. So they measured joint angles, they measured joint moments. And their hypothesis was that differential learning and nonlinear pedagogy would result in decreases in risk factors that are thought to be ACL risk factors, like cutting with a stiff knee, valgus, knee abduction, higher ground reaction forces, those types of things. So over this 12-week program, they taught these people how to kick a soccer ball and how to pass and how to do soccer things, but in the lens of linear pedagogy, nonlinear pedagogy, differential learning. And what they found was that in the groups of differential learning and nonlinear pedagogy, then they retested the 5 meter cut. They found that those people tended to bend their knee more when they cut, tended to reduce overall ground reaction forces. And so I'm going to stop there because then beyond that, there's extrapolation that we can then talk about. But Kevin, what were your initial thoughts on this paper?
You know, I like this paper. I thought it was pretty well done in terms of they were doing a good job at trying to control as much as they could in terms of like, minimizing any sort of crossover between groups. The one thing I did think was kind of interesting was that, we're using different sort of learning methods or, various modes of pedagogy and kind of introducing that into a very kind of sterile, kind of closed environment test, which, I question whether that would necessarily transfer over into something like a dynamic sporting environment. But overall, I thought it was a pretty well done paper. And I think, the hardest thing that I'm having in terms of coming to terms with is I think, right now my lens is very kind of biased because I'm seeing a lot of post-op right now. So I think we need to be careful when we're talking about extrapolating, because essentially this is looking at, healthy populations that don't have any sort of limiters or constraints at the level of the individual. So I think that while it certainly seems to make sense if you look at a lot of like Keith David's work and then things like that in terms of maximizing, skill acquisition and motor learning, there definitely does seem to be a trend in favor of a sort of a nonlinear pedagogy style. I think we need to remember that this is a healthy population, so to speak, and we're basically operating under the assumption that they have all the necessary biomotor abilities to execute in the task without any constraints at the level of the individual. So I think we need to be careful when we're thinking about applying this to a population that is maybe more on the post-op side. It doesn't mean that we don't, because I certainly think that's the way that I would approach things as we reach, sort of end stage. But I think it's hard right now to say that we can only approach skill acquisition from a strictly like nonlinear pedagogy style. I think that's definitely the case as we reach the end stage, but we need to make sure that we have the ability to actually execute the task and accomplish the movement variability that these people were expressing without limitations at the level of the organism. So I guess the way that I would think about it is, if you think of like a game of chess, like the most valuable and dangerous piece is probably the queen, because they have the least amount of inherent movement limitations at the level of the piece itself. So I think that as long as we're checking off the boxes, ensuring that the person, one, has the ability to even get into the joint angles that we're asking them to, whether that be a quad index, the ability to decelerate, et cetera, then I definitely think nonlinear pedagogy seems to be the best way to approach, acquisition of skill, because it's it probably has the most task fidelity. I think that's probably the best way that we perform in a sporting environment. We're not necessarily looking for variability for the sake of variability in the differential learning model. And we're also not expecting everyone to operate under like a textbook sort of presentation. So I would say that it's a long-winded answer for me to say that definitely seems like the best return on our investment is going to be more of a nonlinear pedagogy style. We just have to remember that there are going to be constraints at the level of the individual that probably need to be addressed and improved first before we can simply move into a task where we're adding constraints and expecting to get the same sort of outcome that they did here.
We'll throw it to the group. Anybody have thoughts on what Kevin said or the paper in general, just anything in regards to this topic? Feel free to unmute yourself and hop in.
I thought it was pretty interesting to how there wasn't as much of a difference in between non-linear pedagogy and the differential learning. So kind of just showing that like both promote variability fairly well, and seeing that there was no difference between the two, but both did better than the linear pedagogy. So kind of promoting the variability exposed, or like that the participants were exposed to, assisted in them maybe exploring, I guess, like their coordination or their state space or the boundaries of what they can do, which may have allowed them to maybe express some of those like changes in joint angles and force production in the assessment or test, which I thought was very interesting. I guess like my bias would be more towards like nonlinear pedagogy, just because it's more of a deliberate search or guide towards a certain like exploration, whereas differential learning, from what I understand, is just throwing in random noise to see to kind of add that variability for certain like certain behaviors to emerge, and kind of like it's a little bit more random. And for me, I guess it's hard for me to really apply it like really deliberately. But I just wanted to point that I thought it was pretty cool how like it just kind of points me, or I feel like it's useful in saying like with someone who's healthy, it's nice to apply this method in the sense of like helping somebody explore and like help them see these kinds of changes. But I agree with Kevin in terms of post-op. I feel like that's a completely different population. You can't extrapolate any of this necessarily to that population.
Now do your quad set with your toe pointed 5 degrees that way. Okay, on this next rep of quad set, dorsiflex 10 more degrees. So if anybody's confused on the terms, like nonlinear pedagogy, differential learning, table 2 in the paper on page 4 does a really nice job of just kind of the framework of these concepts without any specific. You can inject your whatever skill and sport activity you have context to, and it does a really nice job of kind of differentiating, which can help if anybody's confused. But thanks, James. Appreciate that, man. Anybody else have thoughts?
Quinn, I have an idea. I guess my thought process would be, at what level, like my question, I guess, would be, at what level of task complexity would the results be this apparent between the linear versus the other two? Like going back to your example of like a barbell back squat, if you took, 66 individuals and broke that down for them, I wonder, would we see the same discrepancy, or would it be smaller? Because, not to call a back squat non-complex, I think comparing it to what they're assessing in here, like the sporting soccer specific movement, I wonder if there'd be a difference or not.
That's a really good question, Miles. And also like they actually didn't test the soccer skills. They tested just a 5 meter cut.
Yep.
So the idea was that this differential learning program over 12 weeks on sporting tasks is going to transfer to this very constrained test, which, by the way, if you guys are, again, run 5 meters straight, cut, it's a 45-degree angle, and then they constrain the speed. So they had to be between 4.5 and 5.5 meters per second, which is on the top end is about 12 miles per hour. And I actually Googled just somebody running on a treadmill at 12 miles an hour just to see how fast it was. And it's not a slow jog, but it ain't a sprint. And they also only controlled for that speed in the entry. They didn't control for that after the cut. So we don't know if the people just cut and then kind of like just rolled through the finish line. And that would change the way that the amount of force that you put into the cut, knowing that you don't have to be a certain speed. You can just kind of slow down. So Miles, that's a great question. I don't know. It's the task. itself, and then what you're assuming it transfers to, if that is the assumption. So it's a really good question.
Yeah, I think that was kind of like one of my biggest sort of limitations or hesitations with this paper is, we're assuming that because we're seeing these changes in kinematics or kinetics with this very, sterile constrained task that is going to transfer into a sporting environment, to your point, Quinn. I think it's just hard to say that necessarily. It's something that we can say like, okay, like, well, with this test, we saw that these were the sort of changes that across groups. It's hard for me to kind of necessarily with confidence make the leap that we would expect the same sort of thing where we're seeing a reduction in, quote unquote risk factors in a sporting environment, just because it's so different. I think that's one of the hardest things about all of this is we're very limited in our ability to make quote unquote sports specific sort of changes. So I think it's just when you're in a performance environment with multiple bodies and it's reactionary as opposed to anticipatory cutting and changes, I think it's just hard to make the case that this is definitely like the answer, so to speak, for minimizing some of those risk factors.
Just to bring context to it, they were just using, like, if you're going to teach somebody how to kick, it was very explicit directions and it was just rote repetition, versus you need to put this ball in that goal. You figure out how to do it. And then maybe the practitioner throws in like a cone that you have to get around. So you'd have to maybe change your foot angle or something, but they don't tell you to do that. You have to figure out that movement solution yourself. And then differential learning would be like, okay, on this rep, you're going to kick it with the side of your foot. On this rep, you're going to toe bash it. I don't even care if it goes in the goal. It's imposed variation of task completion. So just kind of keeping that context in. But yeah, Miles and Kevin, that's a really, really good discussion. Other thoughts from anyone?
Yeah, Kevin, thanks for saying that, man. I'm struggling where some of this comes into a clinician's like context and like what we do or change with this information. Because, Kevin, to your point, if we're talking about what's sport specific, I mean, if it's not the sport, it's not the sport. So like sport specific training that is done in the clinic with us as clinicians, just frankly, it isn't sport specific at all, right? It's not the sport, there's not an opponent. And if they're going to practice, I would think that there are multiple strategies of these types of learning environments that are going to happen just by the sheer nature of the chaotic environment of field and court sports in general, unless, and maybe that changes now if we're talking about some of the examples given here where it was specific to weightlifting or powerlifting, where maybe that type of control is a little bit more within our realm to vary the learning task in this environment, perhaps. Something like a very linear sprint, if they're a very linear track athlete, short distance, or some kind of constraints that they're not worried about any external environment, maybe then this does have some application of where they're putting their foot or how they're striding, or different cones or variable things that you're adding. But as a clinician, I'm not quite sure yet what to do with this information in this context, because it doesn't seem that the way that it's proposed that we would have much control to really engage with the patient in this type of way to create changes. And if our goal is to really create more robust, resilient, capacities and to prepare them for the practice type settings that they're going into, they're going to get those learning environments in the setting of their sport. And I don't think there's anything that I could necessarily do to really prepare them for the sport until it is the sport. I don't know. I don't want to sound too dismissive of the stuff that's talked here, because I do like it. I guess those are some thoughts I'm kind of struggling with in my head. I hope that makes sense.
It makes sense to me. I mean, the scenario in this study, even if you wanted to try to recreate this is going to be you as a clinician going out on the field and just watching them do their sporting tasks. And to your point, Q, is that your job as a clinician, or is that sport coach job? Is your job as a clinician to prepare them from a biomotor, standpoint, maybe start to bridge some skill acquisition or some, some type of chaotic environment to some extent, but it's a great discussion point.
I also think it's a hard thing to extrapolate when we're talking that you had basically 25 to 29-year-old males, 66 of them, that really were novices to this. So how do we, looking at somebody who actually plays the sport, right, who has years of training in the sport, do we know that this carries over, right, to a non-novice, right? Because if I'm dealing with a non-novice who's playing the sport regularly, does this even have any relevance in there? We do not know.
Yeah. I think this is good because I'm hesitating to dig into some of the limitations here too, because I want to bias the breakout room. So I say let's discuss these points. This is good because I think it gives us a lot to talk about. I'm going to put the prompts.
Quinn, real quick, there's a hand up.
Oh, good.
Sarda, if you want to.
Sorry, this might be a really stupid question. I just wanted to ask a question about the article if you guys have the time.
Please.
I just wasn't sure, like relating to table 3, the kinetic and kinematic scores. I see that they're all like different joint angles, but how does that relate to, like, I don't understand how, like, a reduction in the joint angle means that there was a positive change. Like, how do they know what are the optimal joint angles for improvement? I don't really understand that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think they have a threshold for optimal. They have a threshold for a significant statistical change. And their assumption is that, let's say the knee, for example, if you're now cutting with a deeper knee angle, more flexion, that's a positive change. And if the difference is statistically significant, then we're going to call that good. That's how I took it, if that makes sense. So your question, yeah. So you're like, well, why is that good? Like, why does 8 degrees, So I think that's some stuff that we can dig into as well, because that's a really good point. But that's how I interpreted it. And if anybody has anything to add to that, please go ahead. Does that help? Okay, cool.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. You're probably going to talk about that in the groups too, because I'm sure there's other people thinking the same thing, like looking at the differences too. So here are the prompts, which Megan made for us. The great Megan. There's 2. So do you tend to use these styles, or maybe were these styles of learning new to you? Were you familiar with them? Do you use them specifically, or do you just kind of think back and say, oh, I use them, but I'm not actually thinking of these terms? Do you think of the nature of an injury, to Kevin's point, or nature of the sport would change what we're talking about? And then thirdly, do you alter motor learning strategies you use with an athlete depending on the level of play or the level of skill? So to Paul's point, there's beginners in this study, but could we extrapolate this to other groups, intermediates, advanced? So those are our prompts. We're going to give you 15-ish minutes to work those out amongst you. So break you out here. And we'll come back and I think we're going to have some good discussion coming back. So we'll see you soon. Well, do you or somebody from your group want to spill the beans on what you figured out?
I think we covered a lot of good points in our group. I think the general consensus is that we've all used all of these pedagogies in different situations. I said that I generally tend to default to a non-linear approach, but that doesn't mean that we can adjust and adapt depending on what it is that we're trying to elicit or accomplish with whoever it is that we're trying to guide. We also brought up Paul brought up a good discussion point in that time is also an important constraint to consider. when we're talking about these different approaches.
Time that you have with the person
Yes.
to, yeah, right.
Like literal, how much time can we afford to elicit what it is that we're trying to change?
What about other groups? Thanks, Jeremy.
I think in my
Yeah.
group, go ahead.
No, go for it.
I would say in my group, most of us or most of them had just becoming familiar with the different sort of pedagogy styles. So it was a little bit of a discussion on, based off of, how novice of a person are we really talking about? Are you going to change some of your approaches to coaching, so to speak, right? So like, how much bandwidth are you really going to give somebody that's never air squatted before? And I think it's an important point to probably talk about, right? Because I do think that you need to have probably like a certain level of exposure before something like more of the nonlinear pedagogy style or the differential learning is maybe going to be maximized. So I think early on, if you're dealing with somebody who literally has no idea how to move their body, you might be a little bit more towards like the linear pedagogy style, kind of stepwise, sort of thing like that, and then allowing things to kind of shift as you go along. But I think the time points is a really good one too, because I also think that we have pretty good evidence to suggest that the more variability that we do have, it does seem to help kind of normalize those patterns. So I think it's tough to say that, I would choose one sort of style over the other. I generally tend to err more on sort of the nonlinear pedagogy style, to where I feel like the less that I have to speak, probably the better. One, because I just hate human interaction, and two, because I feel like that allows me to get, maximize their sort of, I guess, comfort, so to speak, to where like if I'm having to give a lot of cues and I feel like I'm speaking way too much, I've either probably chosen an inappropriate drill that is beyond the level that they're advanced for, or I'm just not getting what I want out of the movement. So I think I definitely tend to go more towards the nonlinear pedagogy style, but I do think there is a good discussion to be had in terms of, based off of the person in front of you, is there one that's going to be more optimal than the other? And I think that's a hard thing to say with any sort of certainty without seeing just how they respond to the different coaching styles.
Other groups? It's good stuff.
I was gonna mention or talk about how in our group we were just kind of talking overall how this could be applied clinically. And so in the sense, I really emphasize how understanding or having this in your toolbox in terms of the teaching methods you have available to you, it just allows you to be more flexible in finding entry points to creating change in behavior. And so like if variability is something that we know is going to be able to facilitate better exploration of somebody's capabilities, it's something we're going to want to exploit, but knowing when to stop. I think having the options to see what's available to us to kind of maybe pick a starting point and then start to work on it, I think it's useful, because sometimes people just don't know where to begin. And it's okay. And I feel like this is nice and easy to apply if you want to first not only promote exploration in the patient, but you as a clinician coach and seeing what they can or can't do, so you can also get a better sense of how they're moving, and so you also better understand maybe where you need to change your thinking. So I like how, so clinically it just helps somebody promote exploration of their action capabilities by applying more variability, but then kind of pulling it back and saying, all right, once we find a good point, then we know what to work on and really spend a little bit more time on. So I think it actually saves time, because then you're able to find a point to start a little bit sooner, I feel like, rather than forcing a point that you think you have to start.
In our group, one of the things we talked about through the context of basically like the pre-return to practice phase, ACLR, where someone is doing well to progressing into more complex tasks. And we had talked about how it's not like at any point, if say you're going for more of the nonlinear pedagogy format for like skill acquisition at that point. At no point is it such that you can't then be like, awesome, we practice all these tasks and we left it really open to you to find the movement pattern that is efficient for the situation I set up in front of you. Now, as almost like it's like, I think of it almost like an RPE check. It's like, all right, you said it was this, now show me how many you can do. It's almost like, okay, so we gave you this ability to work on skill acquisition. Now I'm going to give you explicit directions. Can you show me that you can do this? Which is the generalized skill acquisition we were looking for from this style. Now, can I give you direction and you still show me you can do this task efficiently, utilizing the joint angles that we want, because you've developed this broad base of a skill set through the nonlinear or DL format, which I thought was interesting.
With papers like this, it's made to be a trichotomy almost, right? Like you're differentiating, you're putting these learning styles in a bubble, in a box by themselves, and then you're comparing them, and then the results are portrayed in a way that says this is better than that. When in what I'm hearing from all of you, it sounds like this is better for that in this context, when I'm dealing with this individual, when the goal is this, but then I might pull linear pedagogy in this context for this person. And so these concepts start bleeding into each other rather than saying better or worse or making it a trichotomy. Or it sounds like we're using all three potentially in certain scenarios, depending on the goal. Is that fair? Is that fair? Any pushback on that?
I think that's fair.
Because not linear pedagogy gets a bad rap, and it seems to be that way. But let's take shooting it. This is just an opinion. Take shooting a basketball. Somebody who's never shot a basketball, never held a basketball. You say the goal is to put this ball in that bucket. Go to town, figure it out, and then you let them flounder around until they do it. But there's a reason why skilled basketball players, most of them, don't do a double-handed push shot or toss it underhand. Over millions upon millions of iterations, of group iterations, we've settled into certain patterns, attractors that seem to, on average, be better than others. And so we can use that information that we already have to give them a little head start. Use this hand to guide the ball, use this hand to shoot the ball, use this hand to kind of guide the ball, and then let go. So maybe you're linear in the beginning, like what Kevin was saying, setting enough boundaries or enough explicit instruction to just get them going in the right direction. And then you can kind of let them explore and flounder from there, that type of thing. And that's how I conceptualize these concepts in real life. And then to Q's point earlier, we're just talking about skills, like coordinative skills, because that's kind of what the paper was talking about. But, if I'm just doing knee extensions, 4 months ACLR, do these concepts even apply at all? Is it even linear pedagogy? You're just going to move this weight, 3 sets of 8, go until it burns. So what's that called? But yeah.
Well, I like your point about how like there's like almost an unnecessary like trichotomization of these, and I think of it just kind of similar to if you just think about like thinking in general. Like you hear like the trope of like, oh well, we want to teach people how to think, not what to think. Well, I can't really teach you how to think unless we've established what to think, right? Like, so you can't perform any sort of mathematical or advanced level arithmetic without first me telling you that 2 + 2 = 4 type of thing. You know what I'm saying? So I think that it's an unnecessary delineation across these three, because in reality, like they're all going to have value and return based off of the person in front of you and where you are sort of in the learning, whether that's strict education standpoint or in terms of like skill acquisition. It's just a matter of kind of, you can't just initiate, differential learning so to speak, without having some sort of base of where, or a foundation to work from in the first part. So I think I like the point about the unnecessary trichotomization, because it does seem as though this paper is kind of presenting it that way. And in reality, I think we all do sort of mix and mash all three of these based off of the outcome that we're looking for and the context of the situation.
In the weight room, I know some coaches and who have done some interesting things. Let's say they have kind of their just progressive loading movements, like back squats, whatever, very traditional progressive loading or whatever the exercise is. But then they have a piece of the strength training, resistance training program that is more exploratory. And I think it would fall under differential learning here sometimes versus nonlinear other times, where it's like, let's say a lunge, where they just say, I want you to perform a lunge, but every repetition has to be different. And then they just back off. And so the athlete goes forward, backwards, lateral, lets their knee come more forward on one of the reps, does a real long stance on one of the reps. So that was the instruction. And then sometimes they'll tell them the variation. Oh, I want you to lunge. First rep is forward, positive shin angle. Second rep is fast, or a vertical negative 0 shin angle. And then the next rep is going to be fast with a positive shin angle. Stuff like that. So they've actually incorporated it into the weight room. My pushback was always, like, to Q's point, if you start getting too fancy, are you ever actually accumulating anything worthwhile? So there's kind of probably a balance there between you're doing something cool and then you're like, yeah, this is cool, differential learning in the clinic, versus like actually doing something meaningful. So it's interesting.
That speaks to what I was meaning when I was saying time, Quinn, is
yeah.
The DL problem is we have so many iterations to find what may be optimal. Do we have the time oftentimes? And is it leading to true change? Because we need reps of meaningful activity, right? I mean, so all the learning is great, but when do we find optimal, and when do we get enough reps with optimal to make a change, right? And so that's part of that problem with the DL process, is without some of the constraints, this non-directional type stuff. I mean, it may take 10,000 iterations before they know anything. Do I have 10,000 iterations with them before we even get to where we start having meaningful reps? And for me, that's part of the trouble with the DL process is, and I use it, but I use it as a free form component of more of the nonlinear, pedagogy, just simply because I offer a little more freedom at times, but I typically am always having some constraints within there because I need to drive a task. I'm trying to adapt a tissue. I'm trying to do something. I've got a target. And once I have a target, I need to control that, because I don't have a whole lot of time to figure out what's the best way to, like, if I just handed somebody a basketball and said, put it through the hoop, right? Great. But now they may knee it, they may punt it, they may do all these other kind of things, right? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to put it through the hoop. Giving them some of that guidance may be a little advantageous to get us to where we're doing something that looks more like the sport that they're about to go try to play.
And to Q's point, do they even have the range of motion to put it in the hoop? Like, yeah. So it's like establishing when these kind of concepts matter from a skill standpoint. What else do people think?
Honestly, I'm still having a hard time, I guess, extrapolating what they gathered from this data to being risk factors or not for non-contact ACL injuries. So I think I thought of an easy way to fix that. They could just change the title of the article to just how motor learning methods impact a constrained motor task. But I think if they really wanted to extrapolate this data and see how it really does, impact the injury rate in terms of non-contact ACL injuries, it'd have to be some sort of like prolonged follow-up over some sort of season. You know what I mean? Like I'm having a hard time making that leap.
One little exercise that I do sometimes when I'm reading a paper is I'll go through the methods and say, okay, like this is what they're doing. I kind of have it in my head. What can't we say based on this? And I see if it's going to happen. And in this paper, it's like, don't try to say anything about this reducing ACL risk. don't do it, don't do it. And they did it. They didn't do it as much as I thought they would actually. But they did. They took the data, and the conclusion was we've got something here that clinicians can use to try to reduce ACL risk. And to your point, Jeremy, that's not what they studied. So it's just something to take a lot of caution in. I think part of it maybe is a catchy title, get you published. The chances are, something like that. I don't know. Obviously, I'm extrapolating, but your point's well taken. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Also, again, I have no problem with all these different styles of approaching it. And I think so far the group's done a super good job of saying like, yeah, context matters. And, there's a different spectrum of folks and timelines that we're going to be working with, that some of this comes to play. But some of my, devil's advocate or pushback with some of this comes in this form of like, how do we know what really caused change? I think that's a question that we all ask ourselves when you start bouncing around, say in a program. You have all kinds of different things that you're throwing at somebody. And I'm sure that a lot of it works, right? We know that just general exercise and general training, especially for novices, is going to have massively helpful benefit. But gosh, if I just have somebody do some random training stuff that I threw off the top of my head every day, I don't really know what actually caused change at the end of it, even if, and change is good, but then how do I repeat it? So when you're doing something like the DL type stuff, it's like, did they have a set number of things that were random to the person but were set for the clinician? I don't know. And if they did, then I don't know how I would do that. And how many iterations do I have to come up with that are different for every different possible task under the sun? It becomes very enormous. And then I don't know of those reps, which one actually caused the change that I want. So I think a lot of seasoned clinicians that I've talked to get pissed at younger clinicians because they try to make things so overly sexy and sensationalist and novel and cool. And gosh, man, the tried and true just general principles seem to do a pretty damn good job as long as we do a good job coaching and modifying loads and controlling constraints and programming within what the person has. And I think a lot of time our jobs as clinicians, especially if we're talking about ACLRs for those first few months even, and even tendinopathy sometimes, gosh, it's trying to make like really boring shit fucking cool, man, and enjoyable for people, and making them buy into something that like, gosh, it's not the most fun, adventurous thing they've ever done in their life. It's not like climbing Everest or some, euphorical experience, but man, there's a lot of benefit and there can be joy in it. And I think helping people find that is part of the art of what we do. And I don't know if it has to be super, super sexy all the time. I don't know. I'm just playing with ideas in my head. I'm not trying to give any pushback, but maybe something to think about, throw out there.
I think I would have had an easier time with the paper had they just had the outcome measures been something to do with the actual 12-week training program, like accuracy of kicks or some type of measure for skill development, because that's what they were training for, not some random non-specific made up 5-meter cut test at a basically a jog in which they didn't standardize the out velocity, the exit velocity. So yeah,
I think also to Q's point about how you don't know why things change after the intervention too. All three of these groups had increased knee flexion angles after their interventions. And is the difference between 42 degrees and 52 degrees big enough to change a risk factor that, I don't know.
Well, and was I mistaken, or did the linear pedagogy group actually have reduced valgus?
I think they did, but they all ended up between like 4 and 6 degrees anyway.
Yeah, right. So the difference, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, man. It doesn't really, when you think about how myopic it really is, we're looking at degrees here of knee flexion based off of some, we don't even know what the training protocol was, right? All we know is that they just did different sort of learning methods. It's like this really doesn't matter like at all to me. Like, I don't even know what the person did, so I couldn't replicate like their, the training interventions if I wanted to try to recreate this anyways. And, I think to Jason's point, like, is a 42-degree knee flexion on a cut really going to save my ACL versus a 38 or something like that? And I don't know. It's tough, man. I think Quentin made a good point in terms of just all we can really do is try to put the person in a position where they have the movement options available to them when they need it. And however you get there, to me, doesn't necessarily matter too much on terms of, coaching style, so to speak, but it's just, are we making consistent positive adaptations that we want, that we can track measurably and reliably over time?
So echo chamber is boring.
On a lighter note, I thought it was cool that nobody dropped out. That's pretty awesome. 66 people over 12 weeks.
Yeah, the compliance was really good. I wonder if they got better at the tasks though. I gotta give a shit about that stupid cutting thing.
I kind of thought it was interesting, like the population they chose. Why 27-year-old dudes like who don't play soccer? Like, is that like our?
I don't know.
I guess it would be pretty difficult to like. You couldn't. I mean, I don't work with a lot of ACL tears, but I think it's mostly teenagers, like girl teenagers, right? Like that's the like major population. I guess it would be pretty difficult to get kids to be part of a study.
It seemed like they made a case. They were like, well, females have higher rates, but because the more dudes participate in sports, the absolute tears are the same. And we don't want a subgroup because it's complicated, and we'll just do all males.
Right. And they didn't do anything under 18 because they didn't want to have to get parental permission. So it's basically a convenient sample. I mean, that's all it is they probably just have access to them and that's it. And then we'll justify why we went with what the convenient sample is.
Good question, Emma.
I thought I was struggling with the definitions of the terms. But when the DL group, in my mind, when I was reading this article at first, I was thinking like a scrimmage, which I think would be super helpful for ACL rehab. I mean, it's obviously super helpful for ACL rehab. But then when I was thinking about the DL, like the way you were describing it, like the coach puts specific constraints on the person, I was thinking about the entire group at the practice. Does the coach have to do something like a different constraint for every person, like every repetition? You know what I mean? Because if they did the same constraint, then the first person would go do the drill, and then the second person would be like, "Oh, I know what I'm gonna do," and like it just.
Yeah, were they watching each other in the nonlinear pedagogy group? That's a good question. Were they using their own exploration out of their own mind, or were they just watching their? Oh, that's good. That's a good one. That's a really good question. We don't know because they didn't really outline. Emma, I think they practiced the task with the type of learning and then they scrimmaged. So maybe the thought was like using their learning style in a chaotic environment within the session.
I wanted to plug something in, which I just find interesting, given that from a clinical standpoint, how like something like differential learning might be interesting. Like if you look up like how so differential learning in terms of doing all the randomness, it plays off the concept of what's called like stochastic resonance. And that, without getting too complicated, it's just like how I'll just read a definition. Like stochastic resonance is a mechanism whereby a particular level of noise actually enhances the response of nonlinear systems to weak sensory signals. So by adding that randomness, that extra noise, it actually highlights a weak signal that you might be looking for. And that could be potential deficits and maybe movement. And I think that might be something that, or one takeaway potentially clinically, where like doing something like certain movement tasks that are fairly novel, although they're very specific and novel in the sense of like you don't really do them anyway ever, it might highlight something that maybe you're trying to increase or improve from a capacity standpoint. So I just thought I wanted to plug that in because in some. Can you hear me?
Ooh, lost you. We can now.
You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, just kind of thinking about how that applies clinically, or at least conceptualizing the framework and how to apply it rather than trying to take something very, very specific from the study, which I think the study is, it's just nice to highlight how variability changed the behavior in something as simple as this task. So I just, because they were actually going to your point, how you said, why does it matter with this very specific task? It would be more interesting in how it actually changed the learning and the actual skills that they were doing in the interventions on. The thing is, there's actually a lot, like these differential learning and nonlinear pedagogy has been found to improve learning. So they've done, there's a lot more research on that in terms of the actual specific skills. So I actually thought it was interesting that they were able to measure changes in something as simple as a cutting task from providing this. So in contrast to what's already like really being looked at within this kind of field or area.
Quinn, I'm curious what your thoughts are. But for this type of study, where it's a motor learning study, but they're now assessing like kinetics and kinematics, is it a limitation of the study? Because to me, it seems like it would be. Is it not a limitation of the study that they don't also take some measure of performance and then look at the relationship between performance and these kinetic and kinematic changes to see if there's any interaction? Or am I incorrect? Because I don't know this type of study that well.
Well, I'll get, and this, I'll throw this out to the whole group, but it's not a limitation in study design because they didn't violate any type of any methods. They're allowed to, they can do that. Is the test ecologically valid to the program, and then what can we extrapolate? So the idea, I think, for them was, let's constrain the outcome measure for one, so that we can get all of these like 27 different submeasures from it. You can get like every joint angle and all the moments. And first of all, when you have that many outcome measures, you're likely going to pick up something, and it could be just noise. So that's a limitation in methods. But the test itself, for me, is a limitation in interpretation. This is a note that I wrote to myself, Miles, I think, to your question. I wrote to myself, I said, I get making the test anticipated. This is the cutting task. But can we really make any inferences that this would transfer to an unpredictable sporting environment, which would be an unanticipated task? And these studies they're tough. They're hard. They're really hard to control because to Quentin's point, there's so many factors that could have contributed to the change in that one in knee flexion angle, and the changes weren't even that big. So there's just a lot of noise, Miles. It's not necessarily that they violated some type of methods issue. It's a limitation in your and what you can take from it. So yes, and that's kind of how I looked at it. But I would love to hear other people's thoughts on that.
Just to clarify, Miles, was your question kind of more like, say, measuring how well one of these guys could kick a ball at a certain target at the beginning, and then measuring that at the end, in addition to the cut? Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, and then seeing if like the people that had these improved kinematic and kinetics changes were also like the worst, or if they were the best, and like maybe the linear group is now the most skillful soccer player, but they have the worst kinematics. And it's like, I feel like I just want to know, you know?
That was my kind of point too with it. Having something to measure like that. And I also, do we want the changes that occurred in the cutting task? Do I want to, like, are we going to teach? I don't know. Did we actually make them slower? So it comes back to also this argument of measuring change as positive because it changed what we think is a risk factor. that's the outcome versus it changed performance that's meaningful for the task. And cutting with it's a real fast way to get from point A to point B is to put your foot outside of your base with a pretty straight knee and cut hard and change direction at a full sprint. Watch some YouTube videos of Barry Sanders if you want to see some risk factor ACLs. But so that was another question I had to myself is are we just kind of like trying to separate risk and performance instead of seeing this, a little bit more holistically? But
yeah, and then the other question that comes to mind would be like, okay, so say we're drawing an interpretation or a conclusion that, some arbitrary risk factor for ACL tear is going down. What do I do with that information based on this study? Do I just have people randomly kick a soccer ball now? Because this is my ACL protocol. Here's a ball. Kick this ball a bunch of times because it's gonna reduce the risk of potential ACL factor. So I guess I can appreciate the fact that some kind of randomness and different style of learning did change some kind of behavior. I just don't know how far to take that information and extrapolate it and then actually do something useful for somebody else with it.
I think James kind of brings a good point into this, is understanding like this particular study is just a little piece of kind of the body of literature on motor learning. And so I think what I'll take from this study is, here are ways I'm going to identify a goal for a person. And if it's a coordinative skill-based task, we're beyond why is that the goal? Is it a goal for the clinician? I've established it that that's the activity that I want. Then I can think as a coach clinician, I have some options here. Let me try to kind of orient you just enough, and then I'm going to let it go. And now I'm going to put a label as nonlinear pedagogy. But I think there's value here, not in the methods of the paper and the particular kind of outcomes of the study, but just the principles and the concepts. I would have used a performance-based outcome measure, like your accuracy of your kicking the ball into the goal, like, because that makes sense for the training program. But that's what I would do. And I like the concept of, you've got the kind of the basics down, like how to make contact, and to not plant 2 feet in front of the ball when you're going to kick it. Now I'll let you explore a little bit. And so I do think there's value in talking about these concepts, because we do teach skills sometimes at varying points with certain clients. It's not all biomotor, but I definitely think this is much more relevant when we're talking about coordinative skills versus building up some type of quality of just general force production or speed or something like that.
Yeah, well, I think kind of your point right there, Quinn, and James, to yours as well. Would it be fair to say then that this is just providing further evidence that nonlinear pedagogy seems to be a superior mode of intervention if we're talking about skill acquisition and learning? If we just take aside all the joint angles and things like that, if I was going to take one thing away, it seems to me like there seems to be a reasonable amount of data outside of this paper, and now including this, adding on top that nonlinear pedagogy seems to be the most desirable way to enhance skill acquisition and motor learning.
Yeah, it's definitely it's one of the, again, towards the side of nonlinear pedagogy for skill acquisition and learning. Yeah, exactly, as a whole. I also want to highlight something else regarding, like, you can't really apply these frameworks if you don't really establish what you're exactly trying to learn. So meaning if you're trying to build a capacity, there's not much learning happening if you're just doing a task to build a capacity and say, oh, this doesn't work, because it doesn't necessarily, in terms of the skill and learning, you have to keep in mind what information are you attuning to or helping somebody explore, and so I wanted to point that out, because I feel like when we tie it back to something like training and strength conditioning, or even rehab, some of the very specific or very simple tasks we do, we got to remember is there actual learning taking place? Is that our actual goal? And if it is, like, to get to that point, then we can apply, all right, how am I going to teach this person how to do this? So I think it's like knowing when to apply it and knowing when it doesn't really necessarily like fit in is also important to keep in mind.
So there's some inflection point. I mean, all movement's a skill. Like a bicep curl is a skill. It just doesn't take that long to learn. So there's some inflection point where these models become valuable as a framework for a coach clinician. And, we can't define that, but right. That's kind of what we were talking about with like our knee extension, bicep curl jumps versus, yeah.
Exactly. Kind of like, well, once you know it, then you can spend time training and getting that the capacity. All right, I guess you could think of it that way. But then ultimately, like, if you're going to apply more to the learning framework, if you're trying to teach somebody something, you have to know how to help them explore their workspace in that sense. And so this is where these frameworks come in. But once they have it, then it's like, all right, just, get the work done. They know, then you let that, then it's more of like, do your thing. But I think once you build the capacity, this ties in with other aspects of this field, or this kind of talk about calibration. Once you change your capacity or action capabilities, what are you doing to help somebody calibrate those changes to the thing that they want to get better at? So that's where the trends, then there's more learning taking place there. And this is where that applies more so too, or at least that's how I apply it from a coaching perspective, or even clinically. Like once I change something, or somebody gets stronger, then it's like, all right, I need to do something that helps them actualize that strength that's more specific to their goals, whether that be a specific sports skill or whatnot.
Yeah, that's kind of the point I was made, like, initially, is like, if we're talking like a post-op situation, like if you don't have the ability to decelerate or flex your knee because you have some inherent limitation at the level of the organism, right? You don't have the quad index or the ability to generate force quickly enough. Like, this stuff doesn't matter until we have those sort of capacities built in. Then we can get into the weeds in terms of like using some sort of coaching or learning method to help calibrate, to use your phrasing there, James. But until that point, it doesn't matter, because we don't have the inherent abilities at the level of the organism to even execute the task in the manner that we're trying to coach through.
Is that a mic drop moment, Kevin?
I don't think so. I think it was just got a little moment of clarity of thought, thanks to James.
Anybody else have anything?
Might go do some sprints in the backyard.
There you go. Really?
I mean, maybe I might go chase my dog.
Are you doing, did I see that you were doing Derek Hansen's micro dosing sprint program, or no? I know Shelby was. No, okay. Maybe it was just Shelby. Sprints are cool.
I wanted to just quickly put in a plug. I just put I put it in the chat. Rob Gray has a resources page on a lot of these concepts, and includes differential learning. And so if you want to dig a little deeper into like some of the what we spoke about tonight, this resource page he piles on like an accumulation of all the things, nonlinear pedagogy, differential learning, all that yada yada stuff. So for anybody wanting to just get a better understanding of some of the other things that tie into this conversation, I just want to throw that out there.
And James gets $10 every time you click that link. No, I'm totally kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No,
I should.
The Perception Action podcast is awesome. Highly recommend. Sweet. I think we'll wrap this one up. Megan just put the post-meeting survey in the chat. If you could open that up before we close out, and any change that we ever make to these meetings is because of your feedback. So thanks so much, everyone. This was a really good conversation. We will have the next one soon. We have a free webinar, plyo webinar coming up Wednesday from the R2P Academy, and it's free. So just join the CALU Facebook group, and then the registration link is there. I think it's pinned. You might just have to scroll, but it's free plyometric webinar. It's happening this Wednesday. It's gonna be pretty sweet. R2P is a CALU summit sponsor. So they're kind enough to do that for us. And obviously, if you haven't signed up for the CALU Summit, go ahead and do that. I don't have a link because I'm a terrible promoter. Till next time, everyone. Thanks so much. That was awesome. Have a good night.